There's a building in Richmond, Virginia that produces more cigarettes in a single day than some entire countries consume in a year. I'm Jonathan Reed. I study industrial architecture, factories, company towns, the physical infrastructure of American manufacturing. And what I'm looking at right now is one of the most concentrated points of industrial production still operating in the United States. 6 buildings, connected by conveyor systems and automated pathways, stretching across 150 acres just off Interstate 95. Inside these walls, machines produce 600 million cigarettes every 24 hours. That's enough to give every person in North America 1 cigarette daily from this single address. By year's end, we're looking at approximately 146 billion cigarettes, all manufactured here, all shipped from Richmond. Now, I've spent years walking through old factories, steel mills in Pennsylvania, textile plants in North Carolina, automotive facilities in Detroit. And one thing you learn quickly when you study industrial production at scale is the principle of distribution. You spread risk. You don't put everything in one location. You protect against fires, strikes, natural disasters, supply disruptions. Philip Morris, one of the largest tobacco manufacturers in the world, did the opposite. In 2010, they closed their factory in Concord, North Carolina, and moved all domestic cigarette production here. 1 facility, 1 city. Every Marlboro, every Virginia Slim, every Benson and Hedges sold in the United States now comes from this location. That decision goes against nearly every basic principle of industrial risk management, and when I started looking into why they made it, what I found was a story about consolidation under pressure, about an industry that saw what was coming and made a calculated bet on concentration rather than diversification. If you're interested in industrial history, the kind that focuses on buildings, production systems, and the physical evidence of how companies actually operated, I'd appreciate it if you'd subscribe. I try to approach these subjects carefully, without exaggeration. Let the structures and the records speak for themselves. Let's start with what this place actually is. You can see the Richmond Manufacturing Center from Interstate 95. Giant cigarette replicas mounted on the buildings, Marlboro, Benson and Hedges, Merit, logos towering over the roofline, visible to every driver passing through on one of the busiest highways on the East Coast. The facility covers more than 1.5 million square feet of production space. For context, that's roughly the size of 28 football fields under one roof. 6 major buildings connected by internal transport systems, an on-site power generation facility, automated storage warehouses that can hold millions of finished cigarette cartons at any given time. When you look at the architecture, what stands out is the scale of the infrastructure built specifically for throughput. Loading docks designed to handle continuous truck traffic, rail connections for bulk tobacco shipments, ventilation systems built into the walls to manage air quality across that much enclosed space. This isn't a factory that was repurposed or adapted over time. This was purpose-built for cigarette manufacturing at industrial scale. The initial construction began in 1973, and the layout reflects the production philosophy of that era. Linear workflow, centralized quality control, maximum efficiency through automation. What I noticed when I started researching this facility is how much of the infrastructure is built for redundancy within the single location, but not outside of it. Backup generators, multiple production lines that can compensate if one goes down, on-site maintenance facilities so they're not dependent on external contractors for repairs. They built a fortress, self-sufficient, designed to keep running under almost any circumstance as long as the building itself remains intact. And that tells you something about the thinking behind this consolidation. They weren't worried about flexibility. They were worried about control, about maintaining production no matter what external pressures might develop. The company that built this factory started in a very different place, London, 1847. A small tobacco shop on Bond Street, opened by the family of Philip Morris, a German immigrant. Bond Street wasn't Whitechapel. This was where London's upper class shopped. And the timing mattered. Cigarettes were just starting to become fashionable in England, hand-rolled, seen as more refined than pipes or cigars. For years, the Morris family sold tobacco products made by others, but by 1854, Philip Morris himself began manufacturing cigarettes, small scale, targeted at the wealthy customers who walked through his door. In 1873, Philip Morris died. He was 37, a viral infection that probably could have been treated with antibiotics a few decades later. He'd spent his entire adult life building this business, and he died just as it was starting to gain traction. That should have been the end. Most small businesses don't survive the founder's death, especially in the 1870s. But Philip's widow, Margaret, took control, brought in Philip's younger brother, Leopold, and they held it together. Not just survived, grew, expanded production, hired more workers. By the turn of the century, Philip Morris and Company was a legitimate player in the British tobacco industry. What interests me about this part of the story is that the man whose name is on every Marlboro pack never saw any of it. He built the foundation and died before the first floor was complete. His widow and brother built the house. And that's a pattern you see repeatedly in industrial history. The founder gets the credit, but the people who come after, who manage through crisis, who adapt to changing markets, they're the ones who actually build the empire. By 1902, the company had outgrown London. They opened operations in New York, started selling to the American market. For 2 decades, they played it safe. Premium cigarettes, upper-class customers, nothing revolutionary. Then, in 1924, they launched Marlboro, marketed specifically for women. The slogan was mild as May, soft, gentle, feminine. The packaging was white and delicate. Everything about it was designed to make smoking feel acceptable, even elegant for women. It didn't work. Sales were mediocre. In the 1930s, they tried adding a red filter tip to hide lipstick stains. Practical innovation, but it didn't move the needle. Marlboro limped along for years as a niche product. By the late 1940s, Marlboro had less than 1% market share. In an industry that was booming after World War II, soldiers coming home addicted to cigarettes that had been included in their rations, Marlboro was practically invisible. Most companies would have discontinued the brand, cut losses, focused on products that actually sold. Philip Morris saw something different. They saw a name that sounded strong, and they saw a market gap that nobody else was addressing. In 1954, Philip Morris made a decision that would reshape the entire company. They were going to completely reinvent Marlboro, throw out the feminine marketing, erase the mild as May image, reposition it as the most masculine cigarette in America. They hired Leo Burnett, an advertising executive in Chicago, who understood something fundamental about consumer products. People don't buy the product, they buy the identity associated with it. Burnett's solution was to create a character, an archetype of masculinity so powerful it would override decades of feminine association. The first campaign featured multiple characters: a firefighter, a Navy sailor, a construction worker, and a cowboy, each one representing a different type of American working-class masculinity, each one with a tattoo on the back of his hand, a detail that mattered in the 1950s when tattoos were associated with military service, manual labor, toughness. Within 1 year, Marlboro's sales increased by more than 3,000%, from $154 million to $5 billion. I'll repeat that, 3,000% growth in 12 months. In the history of consumer products, nothing had ever moved like that. Marlboro went from irrelevant to unavoidable almost overnight. But Burnett wasn't finished. He noticed that all the characters resonated, but the cowboy resonated differently. There was something about that image, the open landscape, the self-reliance, the connection to the American frontier that cut deeper. In 1963, they went all in on the cowboy. The Marlboro Country campaign launched. Forget the other characters. Marlboro was now exclusively associated with one image, a cowboy, alone in the wilderness, living life on his own terms. The tagline was simple: "Come to where the flavor is. Come to Marlboro Country." The ads were stunning. Big western landscapes, rugged men on horseback, campfires under open skies. It wasn't selling cigarettes. It was selling an idea of American masculinity that every man wanted to embody, even if he worked in an office and had never been on a horse. By the 1970s, Marlboro wasn't just the best-selling filtered cigarette in America. It was the best-selling cigarette, period. And that success created the problem, or the opportunity, depending on how you look at it, that led to Richmond. In 1972, Philip Morris overtook Ray J. Reynolds to become the largest tobacco manufacturer in America. Marlboro was selling faster than they could produce it. They had a problem most companies would consider a luxury. They couldn't make cigarettes fast enough. So they decided to build the largest tobacco manufacturing facility the world had ever seen, and they chose Richmond, Virginia. The logic made sense on paper. Richmond was in the heart of tobacco country. Virginia had been growing tobacco since the 1600s. The infrastructure was already there. Railroads, highways, a workforce that understood the industry, centrally located on the East Coast for efficient distribution. In 1973, they opened the Richmond Manufacturing Center. Initial capacity, 200 million cigarettes per day. The facility was designed with expansion in mind, ready to scale as demand grew. The timing was perfect. The year the factory opened, Marlboro officially became the best-selling cigarette brand in the world, not just in America, globally. Richmond became the engine of that empire. Tobacco came in from farms across Virginia and North Carolina. Marlboro came out, loaded onto trucks, headed to every corner of the country. The operation ran 24 hours a day, 3 shifts, non-stop production. By 1976, Marlboro had surpassed every competitor. Philip Morris had gone from Alsran to undisputed champion in less than a generation, and the factory became embedded in Richmond's economy. Thousands of jobs, union wages, benefits, stability. Entire neighborhoods depended on Philip Morris paychecks. If you were standing in Richmond in 1975, watching trucks roll out loaded with cigarettes, you were witnessing the peak of American tobacco manufacturing. But here's what nobody was paying attention to in 1973. Health studies were starting to accumulate. Surgeon General reports were getting more explicit. Lawsuits were being filed, quietly at first, by people who'd gotten sick from smoking. The anti-smoking movement was small, marginalized, but it was growing. None of that mattered yet. In 1973, cigarettes were still cool. Marlboro was still the cowboy. Richmond was still printing money. The factory represented everything the company had achieved: ambition, efficiency, dominance. It was a monument to the power of marketing combined with industrial-scale execution. Everything was under control. And then the ground started shifting. The 1990s changed everything. For decades, Philip Morris had fought off lawsuits one by one. Their strategy was straightforward: deny everything, fight forever, never settle. They'd never lost a major case, never paid a significant judgment. Then, state governments started suing. Not individual plaintiffs, entire states arguing that Medicaid was being crushed by healthcare costs from smoking-related illnesses, cancer, heart disease, emphysema. The states wanted reimbursement. In 1998, the hammer came down: the Master Settlement Agreement. Philip Morris, along with other major tobacco companies, agreed to pay $206 billion over 25 years to 46 states. $206 billion, the largest civil settlement in U.S. history. Legally, it wasn't an admission of guilt. They just agreed to pay an enormous sum to make the problem go away. Except, the problem didn't go away. 1 year later, the U.S. Department of Justice filed a lawsuit under RICO, the Racketeer-Influenced and Organized Crime Law, the law designed to prosecute organized crime. The accusation was that Philip Morris and other tobacco companies had engaged in a decades-long conspiracy to deceive the public about the health risks and addictiveness of cigarettes, that they'd known smoking caused cancer since the 1950s and hidden it, that they'd manipulated nicotine levels to keep people addicted. The case dragged on for years. In 2006, the ruling came down. A federal judge found Philip Morris guilty of violating RICO. The court concluded they'd engaged in massive, coordinated fraud. The ruling was damning. It didn't just say they'd broken some regulations, it said they ran a criminal enterprise disguised as a legitimate business. Financial penalties kept piling up. In Illinois alone, Philip Morris was hit with a judgment that threatened bankruptcy. The state wanted them to post a $12 billion bond while the case was appealed. Philip Morris threatened to stop paying the master settlement agreement entirely if forced to post that bond. It was a hostage situation. Illinois reduced the bond. But the worst part, from a public relations standpoint, came in 2017. As part of the RICO penalties, Philip Morris was ordered to run corrective advertising, ads where they had to publicly admit what they'd done, on television, in newspapers. The ads were humiliating. Philip Morris had to state in plain language that they'd designed cigarettes to be more addictive, that they manipulated nicotine levels, that smoking kills more people than murder, AIDS, suicide, drugs, car crashes, and alcohol combined. Imagine spending a century building an image of rugged independence and freedom, and now you're forced to go on national TV and say, "We lied to you." Richmond felt the shift. The factory kept running, but the pride was gone. And through all of this, the lawsuits, the RICO conviction, the public humiliation, Philip Morris was watching American smoking rates decline steadily, year after year. In 1973, when Richmond opened, 37% of American adults smoked. By 2013, that number had dropped to 19%, half. The market was dying. And that's when Philip Morris made the decision that brings us to the central question. Why consolidate everything into one location when your industry is in terminal decline? In 2008, Philip Morris split into two companies. Philip Morris International would handle everything outside the United States, where growth still existed, where billions of people in developing countries were just starting to smoke. Philip Morris US would handle the domestic market, the shrinking, heavily regulated, lawsuit-ridden American business. It was a clean separation, a way to protect international operations from the radioactive domestic side. But Philip Morris US still had millions of loyal customers, people who weren't quitting. Despite everything, Marlboro was still the top-selling cigarette in America by a significant margin. The question was, how do you run a business that's shrinking but still profitable? Their answer in 2010 was concentration. They announced they were closing the Concord, North Carolina factory and moving all domestic cigarette production to Richmond. Everything. Every Marlboro, every Virginia Slim, every Benson and Hedges sold in the United States would now come from one location. Now, if you study industrial strategy, this should seem insane. You don't create a single point of failure. What happens if there's a fire, a strike, a natural disaster? The entire domestic supply vanishes overnight. But when I looked at the economics, the decision makes a certain kind of sense if you accept the premise that the market is dying and your goal is to extract maximum profit during the decline. Running multiple factories costs money, maintenance, staffing, overhead. If demand is shrinking, you don't need all that capacity. Better to consolidate into one ultra-efficient facility than keep multiple plants running at partial capacity. Economies of scale taken to the extreme. They poured over $200 million into upgrading Richmond. State-of-the-art machinery, optimized production lines. The factory's capacity increased to 600 million cigarettes per day. And it worked. Despite declining smoking rates, Marlboro's market share grew. In a shrinking market, Philip Morris consolidated power so thoroughly that they squeezed out most of the competition. By 2024, Marlboro's market share in the US was larger than the next 10 brands combined. Think about that. In a dying industry, they'd managed to become more dominant. Richmond became what I'd call a defensive fortress, not built for expansion, built to defend a shrinking kingdom with maximum efficiency. If you're following along and this kind of analysis interests you, looking at how industrial strategy adapts to decline, how companies manage sunset industries, I'd appreciate your subscription. I try to keep these videos grounded in evidence, focused on what the buildings and the business decisions actually tell us. Let me show you what's happening inside that fortress right now. The production floor at Richmond is something most people will never see. The company doesn't offer public tours, but based on industry documentation, equipment specifications, and employee accounts, we can piece together how this operation functions. The floor stretches the length of multiple football fields, rows of high-speed cigarette-making machines, each capable of producing 20,000 cigarettes per minute. In the time it takes you to watch this sentence, one machine has produced over 1,000 cigarettes. The process starts with tobacco arriving by truck, bales of cured leaves from farms across Virginia and North Carolina. The leaves get fed into processing systems that strip, shred, and blend them into exact mixtures. Marlboro has a specific blend. Virginia Slims uses a different formula. Every brand requires precision. Quality control is obsessive. Same length, same weight, same tobacco ratio. Philip Morris figured out how to manufacture consistency at massive scale. A pack of Marlboro bought in Seattle will taste identical to one bought in Miami. Once the tobacco is blended, it moves to the cigarette-making machines. These systems take loose tobacco, wrap it in paper, attach filters, cut everything to exact length, and output finished cigarettes faster than your eye can track. From there, cigarettes move to packaging lines, wrapped into packs, loaded into cartons, stacked onto pallets. And here's where the operation gets really interesting. Richmond uses an automated storage and retrieval system, essentially a massive robot warehouse. Finished cartons get loaded onto pallets, and robotic cranes transport them into towering storage racks several stories high. When a truck needs loading, the system retrieves the exact pallets required and delivers them to the loading dock. No forklifts, no human error, pure automation. At any given moment, Richmond is holding millions of cigarettes in storage, waiting to be shipped. The logistics are coordinated with precision. Trucks arrive, get loaded with specific orders, roll out to distribution centers across the country. The system has to be perfect, because any delay means stores run out of stock, and Philip Morris can't afford that. Marlboro smokers are loyal, but if the shelves are empty, they'll buy something else. What strikes me about this operation is how it represents industrial manufacturing at its most refined. Decades of optimization, every inefficiency eliminated, every process automated where possible. It's also deeply vulnerable. One catastrophic equipment failure, one extended labor strike, one natural disaster, and the entire domestic supply chain collapses. They've traded resilience for efficiency, and so far, nothing has gone wrong. But the factory itself, the physical structure, is aging. Original construction from 1973, over 50 years old now. Equipment gets upgraded, but the bones of the building remain. In 2017, part of the facility, the Philip Morris Blended Leaf Complex, was added to the National Register of Historic Places, a tobacco factory officially recognized as a site worth preserving for its architectural and industrial significance. There's a strange irony in that. We're preserving the monument to an industry built on addiction, while the industry itself is slowly dying. The numbers tell the story plainly. In 1973, 37% of American adults smoked cigarettes. By 2013, that number had dropped to 19%. Today, it's even lower. Between 1998 and 2019, total cigarette consumption in the United States dropped by more than half the market gone. The most dramatic shift happened with young people. In 1997, over 36% of high school students smoked. By 2019, that number had collapsed to 6%. An entire generation rejected cigarettes. The Marlboro ban, who once made every teenage boy want to smoke, lost his power. Kids weren't buying the mythology anymore. Public health campaigns worked. Anti-smoking ads showed people dying of lung cancer, speaking through voice boxes after throat surgery, hooked to oxygen tanks. It wasn't sexy. It wasn't cool. Smoking became something your parents did, something outdated. Philip Morris saw this coming. In the 1990s, they started planning for a future without cigarettes, or at least without traditional cigarettes. They launched what they called Project Sunrise, a corporate rebranding effort to position themselves as a responsible company. They donated to charities, funded youth smoking prevention programs, which sounds absurd coming from a tobacco company, but it was damage control. They were trying to rehabilitate a brand that had become synonymous with death and deception. It didn't work. You can't rebrand your way out of being a tobacco company. But the real transformation started in the 2010s. Philip Morris began investing heavily in alternatives. They developed IQOS, a heated tobacco product. You insert a tobacco stick and the device heats it to release nicotine without combustion. No burning, no smoke in the traditional sense. They poured billions into developing and marketing IQOS globally. Japan became the testing ground, and it took off. Other countries followed. Philip Morris rebranded itself as a smoke-free company. The tagline became "Unsmoke Your World," a direct repudiation of the product that built their empire. And in 2024, Philip Morris International made an announcement that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. Revenue from smoke-free products surpassed revenue from traditional cigarettes. IQOS, nicotine pouches, other alternatives, these were now generating more money than Marlboro. The company that conquered the world with the Marlboro Man was now making more money selling products that weren't cigarettes. Let that settle for a moment. They spent a century perfecting the cigarette, building the most recognizable tobacco brand in history. And now they're actively trying to move customers away from cigarettes and onto alternatives. They're dismantling their own empire because they understand that clinging to cigarettes means slow death. But Richmond keeps running. Even as the company publicly commits to a smoke-free future, that factory on Commerce Road keeps producing hundreds of billions of traditional cigarettes every year. Because millions of Americans are still addicted. They're not switching to IQOS. That product isn't even widely available in the US. They're not quitting. They're still buying Marlboros, and Philip Morris is still selling to them. So you have this strange duality. Philip Morris International investing billions in smoke-free products, winning awards for harm reduction innovation. Meanwhile, Philip Morris USA operates a massive factory dedicated entirely to making traditional cigarettes for a shrinking but still profitable American market. One company, two timelines, operating simultaneously. The past is in Richmond. The future is being built in Italy and Colorado, where Philip Morris has constructed state-of-the-art facilities for IQOS and nicotine pouches. And both are profitable, at least for now. If you've made it this far and you're interested in how industries manage decline, how companies adapt to existential threats, how physical infrastructure tells the story of changing times, I'd appreciate your subscription. I try to look at these subjects without sensationalism, just the buildings, the decisions, the documented evidence. Let me bring this back to where we started. Richmond is still running. As of this recording, that factory produces around 180 billion cigarettes per year. The numbers have declined from the peak, 146 billion in 2010, but production continues. Philip Morris USA still commands nearly 46% of the U.S. retail cigarette market, almost half. In a dying industry, they've maintained dominance through brand power and the loyalty of smokers who refuse to quit. The factory on Commerce Road remains the beating heart of American tobacco manufacturing, even as that heart grows weaker. Drive past on Interstate 95 and you'll still see those giant cigarette logos: Marlboro, Benson and Hedges, Merit. visible to millions of drivers every year. A reminder that even though the industry is dying, Philip Morris isn't hiding. They're still here, still making cigarettes, still putting their logos up for everyone to see. What I keep coming back to is the decision to consolidate, to put everything in one place, to create a single point of failure in an industry facing terminal decline. On paper, it makes sense. Economies of scale, cost efficiency, maximum profit extraction from a shrinking market. But there's something else embedded in that decision, something about control, about visibility, about making a statement. Richmond isn't just a factory, it's a monument to what was, to what Philip Morris achieved, to the moment when they figured out how to manufacture cigarettes at a scale never before seen and dominate an entire industry through marketing genius and industrial efficiency. And it's also a tombstone, the last factory of its kind, the final stand of an industry that America has turned its back on but hasn't quite managed to leave behind. Every cigarette that rolls off those production lines is one step closer to the day when the machines finally stop. But that day isn't here yet. The workers still show up. The machines still run. The tobacco gets processed, rolled, packaged, shipped. The system Philip Morris perfected over decades continues operating with mechanical precision, producing a product fewer people want, but millions still need. That's the legacy. A factory that won't die, even as everything around it changes. I wonder sometimes what future historians will make of Richmond, whether they'll see it as a cautionary tale about consolidation, or as a case study in industrial efficiency under pressure, or simply as the last monument to an empire that knew it was dying and chose to go down fighting. The building itself will outlast the industry. Long after the last cigarette is produced, those 6 structures on Commerce Road will still be standing. Physical evidence of a time when tobacco was king and Richmond was its fortress. What they'll remember, what the walls themselves will remember, is that this was the place where an industry made its final stand, where efficiency met inevitability, where a company put all its chips on the table and kept running the game even after the odds had turned. I don't know how much longer Richmond will keep producing cigarettes. Could be 10 years, could be 30. The decline is slow but irreversible. But for now, the factory runs, the trucks roll out, and the empire dies, one perfectly manufactured cigarette at a time.